In the 80 campaign, when this came up, he defended it, and really he made an oblique reference to Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. You go back, the New Deal planners were borrowing from the Italians and the Germans, and that sent reporters away baffled.
Reagan spoke in his second inaugural address about a second American Revolution, and he sort of wanted to reignite the American Revolution in our own time, in our hearts and minds. But then in his farewell address, which you have mentioned, and which is certainly one of his, one of the understudied addresses, let's put it that way, of his presidency, he talks about. People call this the Reagan Revolution. He doesn't call it that himself, but he sort of accepts that moniker as a description of it. But the Reagan Revolution seems like a sort of come down from the second American Revolution. And I wanted to ask you about these words, if I could just quote from the farewell address, which indicate the agenda remaining after Reagan, the agenda remaining for his students and followers and emulators. But it's also plaintive in a way. He says, those of us over 35 or so years of age grew up in a different America. We were taught very directly what it means to be an American, and we absorbed almost in the air a love of country and an appreciation of its institutions. But now we're about to enter the 1990s, and some things have changed. Younger parents aren't sure that an unambivalent appreciation of America is the right thing to teach modern children. And as for those who create the popular culture, well-grounded patriotism is no longer the style. Our spirit is back. He'd spoken of the new patriotism, but we haven't reinstitutionalized it. Or we haven't sort of intellectualized it in a way, he says. We need to learn it. It has to become both habitual and emotional and also, rational, intellectual. That's a pretty big agenda. And he sounds, as I say, somewhat plaintive, as he knows he hasn't succeeded in turning the popular culture, in re-institutionalizing this new patriotism that he's evoked. He has succeeded in evoking.
Right.
Is that still a sound diagnosis, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I've always thought that part of that passage connects to many things, but one of the things that connected to directly with Reagan is his career in Hollywood goes back to the time when Hollywood was pro-American. Mm-hmm. Often it was immigrants, right? Especially the Jewish studio heads and whatnot, who loved the country and made these pro-American movies. You think about some of the superhero movies we make today, G.I. Joe, Captain America, they kind of blandify them. And the official explanation is, well, we have to sell to a global market, so I don't want to be jingoistic Americans. Well, all right, that may be correct, and because most movies now make most of their money overseas. But imagine that if we didn't have that overseas market for our movies, I'll bet Hollywood would still do the same thing to the superhero movies. Mm-hmm. Sort of the anti-hero ethos of Hollywood really takes hold in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and Reagan sees this. He sees lots of movies, he screens lots of current movies in the White House, and follows some television. And so this was his way, gentle as always, sort of not directly poking you in the eye, his way of critiquing what's happening to Hollywood culture, and I think he understands the wider culture. The universities, media are part of all this, and partly he understands there, I think, the limitation of politics. There's only so much a president can do, and the culture itself needs to be robust. What other politicians talk that way, by the way? Almost none. Right?
Yes. No.
I love that passage. There's more to that. That's just one little part. He goes on quite a bit there about those themes. The Second American Revolution. This is the two sides of Reagan that were always a little bit hard to square. That language is really kind of unhinged and some not unhinged, but it's a little bit easily to go off the rails. You combine that with his fondness for quoting Tom Paine, saying, the radical of the American. We have it in our power to make the world over again, which George Will liked to say is the most unconservative thought imaginable. Anytime, anywhere, that is nonsense. But Reagan loved it, and it was perfectly persuasive. The more nuts and bolts agenda that went with that was what he then called the new federalism, like Nixon with revenue sharing
Right.
and other people. Let's devolve power back to the states. That always got blocked by Congress or whittled way down. Or the states, in their corrupt state these days, didn't want the responsibility coming
right.
back to them. And so it didn't get very far. But that's part of what he had in mind programmatically. But rhetorically, there was always a flourish to that. There was always a little bit heterodox from what most other conservatives would say or think.
Well, but do you think that should be condemned?
I'm not sure. He was able to pull it off, you know.
Isn't the Second American Revolution sort of like the New Deal? I mean, isn't it an attempt to sort of reground politics?
But then what you would have wanted to say, Third American Revolution.
Uh-huh.
Then you would have made it more direct, saying, he might have even borrowed the historicist language of someone like Obama and say, as he actually kind of did other times, the New Deal was great for its time, but now we need to get back to basics or something like that. I mean, he might have laid it out that way.
Well, his relation to the New Deal was ambiguous, as you have written,
Yeah.
and written well about. Right on the one hand, he liked to quote FDR and associate himself with FDR, whom he voted for 4 times, I guess. On the other hand, he would sometimes slip in the little zinger that, you know, the New Deal was based on fascism,
Right.
which is a rather large, exception taking
Yes.
to the New Deal.
Yeah, that's right. The whole fascism comment was fun because it showed, Reagan's originality of mind. You can't imagine the late Howard Baker ever having said something like that. And then defending it when pressed on it, instead of running away from it or saying I was out of context. Or in the 80 campaign when this came up, he defended it. And really he made an oblique reference to Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. You go back, the New Deal planners were borrowing from the Italians and the Germans. And that sent reporters away baffled that someone would say such a thing.
No, and it was cheering evidence,
Yes.
you know, that he really was immersed in the American conservative intellectual movement in a way also that very few contemporary conservative or Republican politicians seem to be.
Yeah.
Have we lost that? Has Reagan made that obsolete in some way? That
That
kind of intellectual marinade?
You know, I would have thought that it would have caused more office holders to say, oh, that's part of what made him so successful is that he did pay attention to ideas in a serious way, even though he wore it lightly. The only person who resembles Reagan in that respect, I think, is Paul Ryan, who's a serious reader of books, and it comes out in his speeches now and then. But he's about the only one. Maybe 1 or 2 others I'm missing, but he's the one of some prominence, obviously.
Right. Well, we've come to the end of our interview. Thank you, Steve Hayward. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.